The purple of a false dawn bled across the eastern horizon, a fragile stain against the immense, dark canvas of the plains. It was a light that promised nothing, a fleeting whisper of color that would soon be scoured away by the relentless sun. Out here, in this forgotten pocket of the West, the silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket woven from dust and distance. It settled in the hollows, clung to the silver-green leaves of the sagebrush, and seeped into the very timbers of the small, solitary cabin that stood as a lone sentinel against the emptiness. The wind, for now, was still, leaving the air cold and sharp in the lungs, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faintest hint of pine from the distant, brooding hills. This was a land that did not welcome softness. It was a place of sharp edges, of cracked earth and thorny plants, a place that demanded resilience or, failing that, surrender. Inside the cabin, a soft light flickered to life, a warm, golden counterpoint to the cool purple outside. Ellie Ray Thorne moved with a practiced economy of motion that belied her size. She was a large woman, built on a scale that matched the vastness of the land she inhabited. Her shoulders were broad, her hips generous, and her hands, though gentle, were wide and strong. The hands of someone who did for herself because there was no one else to do for. In a world that prized women who were delicate and small, Ellie was an oak tree in a garden of daisies. She wore a simple, homespun dress of a faded brown color, practical and sturdy, its seams reinforced by her own neat stitches. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was braided into a thick single plait that fell down her back, keeping it out of her way. The first task of the day, as it was every day, was the fire. She knelt before the hearth of the cast-iron stove, her movements fluid and unhurried. She laid the kindling with the precision of an artist, adding larger pieces of split pine until the foundation was sound. A single match, struck against the stone, was all it took. The flames caught eagerly, licking at the wood, and a comforting crackle filled the small room, chasing away the last of the night's chill. The silence was no longer empty. It now held the heartbeat of the fire. With the stove warming, she moved to the dry sink, pouring water from a bucket into a basin to wash her face. The water was shockingly cold, a jolt that brought a clarity to her thoughts. She looked not at a mirror, a luxury she did not own, but at the dark, warped wood of the cabin wall, her mind already cataloging the day's chores. The chickens needed to be let out and fed, the small herb garden weeded before the sun grew too fierce, and the sourdough starter needed tending. Later, she would check her snares for a rabbit and spend the afternoon grinding dried yarrow into a fine powder for poultices. Her life was a rhythm of tasks, a steady, predictable beat that kept the deeper silence, the loneliness at bay. She had come to this piece of land 5 years ago, after her parents had succumbed to a fever that swept through their wagon train. They had been headed west with dreams of green valleys and rich soil, but their journey ended here, on this arid plateau that no one else had bothered to claim. Ellie, then just a girl of 17, had buried them herself, using her father's shovel to dig into the hard, unforgiving ground. She had finished the cabin he'd started, using his tools and the knowledge he had passed down to her. She had learned the land, not as a conqueror, but as a quiet tenant. She learned which roots were edible, which leaves could soothe a fever, and which berries would kill a man. The land, in its own harsh way, had become her only kin. The people in the nearest town, a dusty collection of buildings a half-day's ride away called Redemption, had their own name for her. They called her Big Ellie. It was never said with overt cruelty. Not usually. It was stated as a fact, like describing a landmark. Go past the bent cottonwood, and you'll see the turnoff to Big Ellie's place. But beneath the simple description, there was always a current of pity. The women of the town, with their cinched waists and fretful glances, would watch her as she traded her eggs and herbal remedies for flour and salt. They saw a woman alone, a woman of a size that, in their eyes, precluded the possibility of a husband, of a family. They saw a tragedy, a life unlived. They did not see the quiet satisfaction in her eyes when she pulled a perfectly baked loaf of bread from her oven, its crust a deep, burnished gold. They did not see the skill in her hands as she stitched a wound for a ranch hand who'd gotten careless with a branding iron, her touch surprisingly delicate. They did not know the peace she felt in the early mornings, with just the fire and the rising sun for company. They saw her sighs, and they saw her solitude. And from those two facts, they wrote her entire story. Ellie knew this. She felt their pity like a constant, low-grade fever. It was more tiresome than outright malice. Malice, at least, was honest. She hummed a tuneless melody as she worked the sourdough, her strong hands folding and turning the sticky dough on a floured board. The starter was her inheritance, brought all the way from Ohio in a small crock, a living link to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The smell of it, tangy and alive, filled the cabin. It was the smell of continuity, of survival. She shaped the dough into biscuits, placing them in a cast-iron skillet, and slid them into the oven. Soon, the rich, yeasty aroma of baking bread joined the scent of the starter and the wood smoke, creating a perfume of pure, unadulterated comfort. She fried thick slices of salt pork, the fat rendering and sizzling, and brewed a pot of coffee, strong and black. Breakfast was a solitary affair, eaten at a small, sturdy table she had built herself. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. The biscuit was light and fluffy on the inside, with a satisfyingly crisp crust. The salt pork was a shock of savory flavor, a necessary indulgence in a life of simple means. This was her kingdom, this small cabin, this quiet meal. Here, she was not Big Ellie, the object of pity. She was Ellie Ray Thorne, mistress of her own domain, a woman who knew how to turn flour and water into sustenance, how to make a home in the heart of nowhere. After cleaning up, she stepped outside. The sun had now cleared the horizon, bathing the landscape in a clean, golden light. The air was still cool, but the promise of warmth was there. Her 3 hens clucked a greeting as she unlatched the door to their small coop, and they bustled out, pecking at the ground. She scattered a handful of cracked corn for them, smiling as they squabbled over the choicest bits. "Good morning, ladies," she said, her voice soft from disuse. "Did you sleep well, Bess? You stopped bullying Martha." She spoke to her chickens often. They were better company than most people. They did not judge, they did not pity, and they gave her eggs in return for their keep. It was a fair and honest transaction. She spent the next hour in her garden, a small, fenced-off patch of earth she had painstakingly cultivated. It was a miracle of stubborn life in the dry soil, rows of sturdy greens, resilient beans, and hardy squash fought for their place in the sun. But her real pride was her herb patch, lavender, comfrey, chamomile, yarrow, and a dozen other plants grew in fragrant clumps. She moved among them, her fingers gently plucking a yellowing leaf here, loosening the soil there. These plants were her allies, her pharmacy, a decoction of willow bark for a headache, a poultice of comfrey for a sprain, a tea of chamomile to soothe a troubled spirit. She had a healer's touch, an intuition for the secret properties of the green and growing things. It was a gift from her mother, the one thing the fever hadn't been able to take away. As the sun climbed higher, she sat on the small porch step, a cup of lukewarm coffee in her hand, and looked out at the vast, unending landscape. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, filled with the hum of insects and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. This was the time of day when the loneliness sometimes pressed in, a dull ache in the center of her chest. It wasn't a desperate, sharp-edged loneliness, but a quiet, chronic condition, like a joint that ached when the weather turned. She had long ago given up the girlish dreams of love and marriage. Such things were for other women, women who were built differently, who could fit into the narrow confines of a man's world. She had seen the way men's eyes slid past her, their gazes either dismissive or, worse, filled with a sort of morbid curiosity. She was not a part of their world of flirtations and courtships. She was a feature of the landscape, as fixed and unremarkable as a boulder or a twisted juniper tree. And she had made her peace with that. Mostly, she had built a life for herself that was solid and real. It was a life of her own making, beholden to no one. She had food in her belly, a sturdy roof over her head, and work that gave her purpose. It was more than many people had. It should be enough. She did not pray for a husband or for love. Her prayers, when she offered them up to the vast, indifferent sky, were far more practical. She prayed for rain, but not too much. She prayed for her hens to keep laying and for the frost to hold off until after the harvest. She prayed for her snares to be full and for her roof to withstand the winter winds. She didn't hope for happiness, a concept that seemed as distant and unattainable as the moon. Instead, she hoped for a tomorrow that was just a little less windy than today, a day where the constant, wearing pressure of just getting by would ease, if only for a moment. A gust of wind picked up, rattling the leaves of the lone cottonwood that grew near the cabin. It was a lonely sound, the sound of the world's vast, empty sigh. Ellie Ray Thorne pulled her shawl tighter around her broad shoulders, finished her coffee, and stood up. The sun was getting higher. There was work to be done. The spring day, which had begun with such clean, quiet light, had soured by late afternoon. The sky turned the color of a bruise, and a restless wind began to prowl the plains, kicking up spirals of dust and making the lone cottonwood tree by Ellie's cabin thrash its branches as if in a fever. Ellie had brought her chickens in early, secured the shutters, and double-checked the latch on her door. She knew this sky. It was a liar, promising a brief squall, but often delivering a night of raw, unrestrained fury. By the time darkness fell, it was as if the world had been submerged. Rain came not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the roof and walls of the small cabin. The sound was deafening, a constant roar that vibrated through the floorboards. Each gust of wind felt like a physical blow, and the timbers of the little house groaned in protest. Outside, the world was a churning chaos of blackness and water. Lightning tore the sky open in jagged, silent flashes, and for a split second, the landscape would be illuminated in a stark, ghostly white, a world stripped of all color and softness. Then the thunder would follow, a deep, guttural concussion that shook the very ground. Ellie sat by her stove, the only source of steadfast warmth and light in the maelstrom. She was mending a tear in one of her flour sacks, her needle moving with a steady, rhythmic pace that was a small act of defiance against the storm's chaos. She was not afraid. She had weathered countless storms alone in this cabin. She knew its sounds, its strengths, and its weaknesses. The house was like an extension of herself, sturdy, solitary, and built to endure. It was in a brief lull between thunderclaps that she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was a frantic, desperate drumming that was almost lost in the roar of the rain. Hoofbeats, fast and wildly uneven. A cold knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. No sane person would be out riding on a night like this. It was a death wish. The sound grew louder, closer, a frantic tattoo of panic. Then it was punctuated by a shrill, terrified whinny from a horse, followed by a sickeningly heavy thud that seemed to shake the earth right outside her door. And then, nothing. The hoofbeats were gone. Only the relentless drumming of the rain remained. Ellie's needle stopped mid-stitch. She sat perfectly still, listening, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to ignore what she had heard. The world outside was dangerous, but the sound of that fall, the sheer finality of it, had lodged itself in her mind. It was the sound of a life hitting the ground, hard. For a long moment, she wrestled with herself. To open the door was to invite the storm in, and perhaps something worse, but to leave someone out there, injured, while she sat warm and safe by her fire. It was not in her nature. With a sigh that was part frustration and part resignation, she put down her sewing, stood up, and took the heavy oil lantern from its hook by the door. She pulled on a thick wool shawl, its fibers already smelling faintly of damp from the humidity, and took a deep breath. The moment she unlatched the door, the storm threw it inward with a violent crash. Wind and rain exploded into the cabin, extinguishing her carefully tended lamp and sending papers and dried herbs scattering across the floor. Gritting her teeth, Ellie put her shoulder to the door and fought to push it closed enough to relight the lantern. Her fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled with the match. But finally, the wick caught again, casting a wild, dancing light. Holding the lantern high, she stepped out onto her small porch. The force of the wind and rain stole her breath. It was like walking into a waterfall. The light from her lantern was pitiful, a small, fragile bubble of yellow in an ocean of roaring blackness. It illuminated a world of churning mud and flattened grass. A few feet from her porch stood a horse, a magnificent black creature, its sides heaving and its eyes wide with terror. It was riderless. Ellie followed the direction the horse was facing, her boots sinking into the mud, and there, lying in a heap near the skeletal form of a sagebrush, was the source of the thud. It was a man, a giant of a man, sprawled on his side, his face turned away from her. He was utterly still. "Hello," she called out, her voice snatched away by the wind. "Mister, can you hear me?" There was no answer. He didn't move. She moved closer, the lantern light sliding over the dark, soaked wool of his coat. He was enormous, even lying down. He seemed to take up an impossible amount of space. She knelt beside him in the mud, her dress instantly soaked through. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched his shoulder. It was like touching a wall of solid muscle. She gave him a gentle shake. "Mr. A low groan escaped his lips. He was alive. The groan galvanized her. All fear and hesitation vanished, replaced by a clear, focused purpose. She had to get him inside. She hooked her lantern onto a low-hanging branch of the cottonwood, freeing her hands. She tried to lift him by the shoulders, but it was like trying to lift a felled tree. He was dead weight, and there was so much of him. She readjusted her grip, hooking her hands under his armpits from behind. She dug her heels into the slick mud, planted her feet, and pulled. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she was a strong woman, her strength born of years of solitary, hard labor. He moved, only an inch, but it was a start. She pulled again, dragging him through the mud, his heavy boots carving 2 deep furrows in the earth. It was a brutal, exhausting struggle. The rain beat down on her, plastering her hair to her face and obscuring her vision. Step by agonizing step, she dragged the mountain of a man across the yard and onto the relative shelter of the porch. Getting him through the doorway was another battle entirely. He was too long, his limbs too awkward. Finally, with a last desperate heave that left her gasping for breath and seeing stars, she pulled him over the threshold and onto the wooden floor of her cabin. She immediately slammed the door shut against the storm and dropped the heavy bar into place. For a moment, she just leaned against the door, her chest heaving, her body trembling with exertion. The only sounds were her own ragged breaths, the crackle of the fire, and the muffled roar of the rain outside. The giant lay on her floor, a puddle of muddy water spreading out around him. Slowly, she pushed herself away from the door and went to him. She brought the lantern closer, its steady light revealing him more clearly now. His face was turned towards the fire. He had thick, dark hair, plastered to his head with rain and mud. A nasty gash on his temple was bleeding sluggishly. His face was all harsh angles, a strong jaw covered in dark stubble, a straight nose, and a wide mouth set in a grim line of pain. But even in unconsciousness, there was a profound weariness etched into his features, a sadness that seemed to seep from his very bones. With practiced efficiency, Ellie went to work, She fetched a clean bucket of water and strips of old linen. She gently propped his head up on a folded blanket and began to clean the wound. His skin was cold to the touch. She knew she had to get him out of his wet clothes before a chill set in and took him. His coat was a heavy, waterlogged monstrosity of wool and leather. Undoing the buttons with her cold fingers was a challenge, but she managed it, pulling the garment off his massive shoulders. Underneath, his shirt was soaked through as well. There was no modesty in this, only necessity. She used her sewing shears to cut the shirt up the front, peeling it away from a broad, powerfully muscled chest that was sparsely covered in dark hair. As she worked, she saw the old, faded scars that crisscrossed his back and shoulders thin, white lines that spoke of a past filled with pain. They were old wounds, long healed, but they told a story of their own. She cleaned the gash on his head with a tincture of yarrow to stop the bleeding and prevent infection, then bandaged it neatly. She covered him with every dry blanket she owned, tucking them in around his large frame. Then she stoked the fire until it was roaring, filling the small cabin with a dry, life-giving heat. She put a pot of rabbit stew on to heat, the last of what she'd made 2 days prior. The smell of broth and herbs began to fill the room, a scent of comfort and care. She pulled a low stool to the hearth and sat, watching him, listening to the sound of his breathing, which was shallow but steady. An hour passed. The storm began to lose its fury, the rain softening to a steady drumming on the roof. The man on her floor stirred, his eyelids fluttering. He let out another low groan, and his eyes opened. They were a startlingly clear shade of gray, the color of the sky just before a storm. They blinked slowly, taking in the unfamiliar ceiling, the flickering firelight, the woman sitting quietly and watching him. Confusion clouded his features, followed by a flicker of alarm as he tried to sit up, only to fall back with a sharp intake of breath. "Easy now," Ellie said, her voice calm and low. "You took a bad fall from your horse. You're safe here." His gaze settled on her. She was used to the way men looked at her, the quick, dismissive glances. But this man's gaze was different. It was direct, and it held no judgment. It was simply the look of a man trying to make sense of where he was. He looked at her face, her large frame, the capable hands resting in her lap. "Where?" His voice was a rough, gravelly whisper. "My cabin. Your horse threw you just outside. The storm." She gestured vaguely towards the door. He seemed to process this slowly. His gray eyes swept the small, tidy room, taking in the shelves of dried herbs, the neatly stacked firewood, the mended flour sack on the table. They came to rest on her again. "McCrae," he rasped. "Silas McCrae." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She knew that name. Everyone in a 100-mile radius knew that name. Silas McCrae was the sole heir to the sprawling Cross Creek Ranch, the largest and most prosperous spread in the territory. She also knew the stories about his father, a man universally feared for his cold heart and cruel temper, who had passed a year ago. Silas McCrae was from a different world, a world of wealth, power, and violence. What was he doing out here, thrown on her doorstep? She simply nodded. "Ellie Raythorne." He tried to push himself up again, a flicker of pride and stubbornness in his eyes. "I need to go." "You'll do no such thing," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You've got a knot on your head the size of a hen's egg, and you're shaking with cold. You'll stay put until morning." She stood and ladled some of the hot stew into a bowl. "And you'll eat this." She brought it to him, holding it while he used his one good arm to slowly, painfully prop himself up against a wall. He didn't argue. He took the bowl, his large, scarred hand trembling slightly. He ate in silence, his eyes never leaving the fire. The silence in the cabin was thick and strange. It wasn't the comfortable, familiar silence Ellie was used to. It was heavy with unspoken questions, with the vast gulf between their two lives. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The only sounds were the drip of water from the eaves and the steady crackle of the fire. Silas finished the stew and handed the empty bowl back to her. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, the words gruff but sincere. "You're welcome, Mr. McCrae." He watched her as she moved about the small cabin, cleaning the bowl, tidying up. His gaze was unnerving. It was quiet, observant, and deeply, profoundly sad. It was the gaze of a man who carried a weight far heavier than his own massive frame. Ellie felt a strange flutter in her chest, an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation. This was dangerous. Not the man himself for all his size. She did not feel threatened by him. The danger was in the silence, in the strange, unexpected peace that had settled between them. It was a peace that felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river. It was the peace of two lonely souls sharing a single small, warm space against the vast, cold darkness of the world. And for a woman who had built her entire life on the solid rock of solitude, that kind of peace was the most dangerous thing of all. The morning after the storm, Silas McCrae was gone. Ellie woke to the pale, washed-clean light of dawn and found the pallet of blankets by the hearth empty, folded with a neatness that surprised her. On her small table sat a silver dollar, its polished surface gleaming in the morning sun. It was more than fair payment for a bowl of stew and a night's shelter, and the sight of it made a complicated knot tighten in her stomach. It felt like a transaction, a clean and simple end to a strange and unsettling night. It was for the best, she told herself. He was a man from a different world, and his brief, chaotic entry into hers was an anomaly, like a hawk mistakenly flying into a barn. Now he was gone, and her life could return to its quiet, predictable rhythm. For 3 days, it did. The sun shone, the chickens laid their eggs, and the silence of the hollow was broken only by the wind and the cry of a distant coyote. Ellie worked her garden, tended her herbs, and tried very hard not to let her eyes drift to the narrow track that led away from her cabin. She pushed the memory of the giant with sad, gray eyes to the back of her mind. She scrubbed the spot on the floor where he had lain, as if to erase any lingering trace of his presence. Solitude was her fortress, and its walls had been breached. She needed to repair them, to reinforce the belief that had kept her safe for so long she was meant to be alone. On the 4th day, the sound of a horse's steady hoofbeats broke the afternoon stillness. It was a different sound from the frantic drumming of the storm-panicked animal. This was a slow, deliberate approach. Ellie was behind her cabin, splitting firewood, the axe feeling comfortable and familiar in her hands. She paused, resting the axe head on the chopping block, and listened. Her heart began a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. She knew, with a certainty that frightened her, who it was. Silas McCrae rode into the clearing on the same black stallion, which now looked calm and powerful in the bright sunlight. He stopped the horse a respectful distance from the cabin and swung down from the saddle. He moved with a stiff grace, as if his large body was a burden he was long used to carrying. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands as he walked towards her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. Ellie's hands tightened on the handle of the axe. She felt exposed, caught in the middle of her daily labor. "Mr. McCrae." "My foreman says you have a skill with herbs," he said, getting straight to the point. He did not seem like a man who wasted time on pleasantries. "We've a calf that's taken ill. Scours. He thought you might have something for it." It was a perfectly reasonable request. Ranchers and homesteaders for miles around knew of her remedies. But coming from him, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like an excuse. Still, she could not refuse to help a sick animal. "I have something that might settle its stomach," she said, her voice more clipped than she intended. She leaned the axe against the cabin wall and led the way to her herb garden. He followed her, his long strides easily keeping pace. He was so large he seemed to block out the sun, casting a cool shadow over her as she knelt by a patch of fragrant chamomile. She worked with her back to him, acutely aware of his presence. She could feel his eyes on her, and it was a strange and unnerving sensation. Men looked at her, but they rarely watched her. Their eyes would register her size and then slide away, as if there was nothing more to see. Silas McCrae watched her as if he were trying to learn something. He watched the way her strong, capable hands moved among the plants, selecting the best blossoms, the way she tied them into a neat bundle with a piece of twine. He was watching her work. "This will need to be steeped in hot water and mixed with its feed," she said, standing and turning to face him. She held out the bundle of chamomile, a little at a time. He took it from her, his large, calloused fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, sharp and unexpected. She pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned. His expression didn't change, but his gray eyes held hers for a moment longer than was necessary. She saw no pity in them, no curiosity, only a quiet, steady attentiveness. He reached into his pocket. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," she said quickly. "It's for the calf." She could not bear the thought of another one of his silver dollars sitting on her table, a cold and impersonal payment. He paused, his hand still in his pocket. He seemed to consider her words, then gave a slow, single nod. "I'm obliged to you, ma'am." He put his hat back on, the gesture signaling the end of the exchange. He turned, walked back to his horse, and mounted in one fluid motion. Without a backward glance, he rode out of the clearing, leaving Ellie standing in a silence that felt louder and emptier than before. She stayed there for a long time, the spot on her fingers where he had touched her still tingling. She was angry with herself for her reaction. It was just a man buying herbs, a simple transaction. But her heart refused to believe it. Her fortress of solitude felt flimsy, its stones loosened by a single, accidental touch and a quiet, unsettling gaze. A week passed. The memory of his visit began to fade, and Ellie chided herself for being a fool. Of course he wouldn't be back. He had gotten what he needed. He was the master of the Cross Creek Ranch, a man of property and standing. He had no more reason to visit a solitary woman in a forgotten hollow. Then, one afternoon, she heard the hoofbeats again. This time he was leading a pack mule, which was laden with something heavy wrapped in canvas. He dismounted and untied the load, revealing a new cast-iron stove door. It was identical to her own, which had a crack running through it and a broken hinge that she had to prop shut with a piece of wood. "My father ordered 2 of everything," he said by way of explanation, his eyes on the cracked door of her stove. "This has been sitting in a crate for 10 years. No use for it at my place." Ellie stared at the new door, then at him. Her mind raced, searching for the logic in this. "Mr. McCrae, I can't accept that." "It's not a gift," he said, his tone flat. "It's a trade. Your stove is a hazard. If it fails, you'll burn your house down or freeze in the winter. It's better on your stove than rusting in my barn." He was already unhitching the tools from his saddle. He was not asking for permission. He was stating a fact. Before she could protest further, he was on her porch, his tool roll spread out on the boards. He was going to fix her stove. She stood in the doorway, feeling helpless and overwhelmed, and watched as he worked. He had to duck his head to get into her cabin, and once inside, the small space seemed to shrink around him. He moved with a surprising carefulness, his large frame navigating her furniture without bumping into a single thing. He knelt before the stove, and for the next hour, the cabin was filled with the sounds of his work, the squeak of old metal, the sharp rap of a hammer, the low grunt of exertion as he lifted the heavy new door into place. Ellie found herself frozen, unable to do anything but watch him. She made a pot of coffee, her hands moving on their own while her mind churned. This was not right. This was not how the world worked. Men like Silas McCrae did not show up at the homes of women like her and fix their stoves. They had people for that, ranch hands, blacksmiths. Why was he here, on his knees on her floor, his face smudged with soot? Was this his way of paying a debt for the night of the storm? If so, it was a debt far in excess of what was owed. The thought that kept circling in her mind, ugly and persistent, was that this was some form of charity, that he saw her, poor, lonely Big Ellie, and felt a pang of pity. The thought was humiliating. It made her skin crawl. She had never asked for anyone's pity. She had built her life specifically to avoid needing it. When he was finished, he stood and wiped his hands on a rag, leaving a dark smudge on his cheek. The new door hung perfectly, black and solid. The stove looked whole again. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. She handed him a cup of coffee. He took it, his fingers wrapping around the tin cup, making it look like a child's toy. "It will draw better now," he said, his eyes on his handiwork. He drank the coffee standing on her porch, leaning against one of the support posts. The silence stretched between them, but it was different this time. It was the quiet of a shared task, a shared space. He wasn't looking at her now, but out at the vast, empty land that was her front yard. "It's quiet out here," he said, more to himself than to her. "I like the quiet," she replied, standing in her doorway. He gave a slight nod, his gaze distant. She saw the sadness in his eyes again, a deep, weary ache that seemed to have settled there permanently. For the first time, she saw past the name, past the ranch, past his intimidating size. She saw a man who carried a loneliness as vast and as heavy as her own. The realization was a crack in the very foundation of her defenses. Her long-held belief, the one that protected her, was that their worlds were separate, that a man like him and a woman like her were fundamentally different creatures. But in that moment, seeing the echo of her own solitude in his eyes, the line between them blurred. He finished his coffee, handed her the cup, and left as he had before, with a simple "ma'am" and a tip of his hat. He came back 4 days later. This time he had 2 rabbits, freshly skinned and dressed, hanging from his saddle. He didn't offer an excuse. He just held them out to her. "A trade," he said. His eyes flickered to the sack of flour she had just bought in town, for a loaf of bread. Ellie's heart was a confused, fluttering thing in her chest. An exchange, not charity, not payment for a debt, a simple, honest trade between neighbors. It was the most normal and, therefore, the most terrifying thing that had happened to her in years. She took the rabbits, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "It will be an hour," she said, her voice quiet. "The dough is rising." She had expected him to leave and come back, but he just nodded and settled himself on her porch step, leaning his back against the post as if he had all the time in the world. He was going to wait. Ellie went inside, her mind a whirlwind. She worked the dough, punched it down, and shaped it into a loaf, her movements automatic. Through the open doorway, she could see him sitting there, his long legs stretched out, his hat tipped low over his eyes. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting in the sunshine, breathing the air. He was a constant, solid, and deeply unsettling presence. She knew what the townspeople would say if they could see this. The whispers, the sly smiles, the pitying looks that said she was a fool to think a man like Silas McCrae could have any real interest in her. He must be lonely, they would say, but not that lonely. She had heard variations of those words her whole life. They were the stones she had used to build the walls of her fortress. But Silas McCrae wasn't the townspeople. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with an unwavering, quiet attention that was beginning to feel more real than all the whispers and insults combined. Every time he showed up at her door, every time he met her gaze without flinching or looking away, another one of those stones crumbled. Her carefully constructed reality, the one in which she was invisible and unlovable, was beginning to fall apart. And she didn't know if what lay on the other side was a beautiful new world, or just rubble and heartbreak. When the bread was done, she wrapped it in a clean cloth. The smell of it, warm and yeasty, filled the air as she brought it out to him. He stood up as she approached. "Thank you," he said, taking the loaf. Its warmth seeped through the cloth into his hands. "And thank you for the rabbits," she replied. He stood there for a moment, holding the bread, as if he wanted to say something more, but in the end, he just nodded, turned, and walked to his horse. Ellie watched him ride away until he was just a small speck against the horizon. She went back inside, the two rabbits a heavy, real weight in her hands. The cabin felt impossibly empty now. The silence he left behind was no longer peaceful. It was hungry. It was waiting. He had come to her cabin 3 times, and with each visit, he had chipped away at her certainty. She still believed that men like him didn't stop for women like her, but the terrifying truth, the one she was too afraid to even whisper to herself, was that this one did. This one kept coming back. The need for supplies was a practical and unwelcome anchor, tethering Ellie's solitary world to the town of redemption. For weeks, she had managed to put off the journey, making do with what she had, stretching her reserves of flour and salt, but now the salt crock was nearly empty. Her kerosene can was perilously light, and the small bottle of laudanum in her medicine chest was down to its last few drops. Her hens were laying well, and the basket of pale brown eggs was the only currency she possessed. There was no avoiding it any longer. She hated going to town. Her hollow, with its predictable silences and honest rhythms, was a sanctuary. Redemption was a place of noise, judgment, and 1,000 tiny social rules she did not understand or care for. It was a place where she was most acutely aware of her otherness, of the space she occupied in the world and the way people's eyes skated over it. In recent weeks, this reluctance had sharpened into a genuine, gut-deep anxiety. The memory of Silas McCrae's visits, the quiet intensity of his gaze, the surprising comfort of his presence was a fragile, secret thing. To take it into the harsh, open glare of the town felt like carrying a delicate new sprout into a hailstorm. She feared what the world would do to it. She hitched her old gray mule, Clementine, to the buckboard cart. The mule, patient and placid, was her only companion on these trips. Ellie loaded the basket of eggs, carefully packing them in straw, along with a few bundles of dried herbs she hoped to trade. She wore her best dress, a dark blue calico that was faded but clean, its patches neat and tidy. It was not vanity that made her choose it, but a need for armor. She tied a bonnet firmly under her chin, its brim hiding her face from the sun and, she hoped, from the prying eyes of others. The journey was long and dusty. The sun beat down, and the wheels of the cart kicked up a fine red powder that coated everything. Ellie kept her eyes on the horizon, on the hazy line where the brassy sky met the brown earth. She tried to keep her mind empty, but thoughts of Silas kept intruding. His visits had become a quiet, unspoken part of her week. He would appear without warning, sometimes with a brace of quail, other times with a length of rope he thought she might need, and once with a small, chipped whetstone to sharpen her axe. He never stayed long. They would exchange a few sparse words, a trade would be made, and he would leave. But the silence he left behind was now filled with a different quality, not of emptiness, but of anticipation. Her fortress of solitude had a visitor who knew how to come and go without tearing down the walls, and the realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. As the dusty cluster of buildings that made up Redemption came into view, the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She clicked her tongue, urging Clementine forward. The town was just as she always remembered it, a wide, rutted main street flanked by a dozen or so wooden buildings with false fronts that tried to lend them a dignity they didn't possess. There was the saloon, already noisy despite the early hour, the blacksmith's, from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer rang out, and, at the far end, her destination Abernathy's Mercantile, the town's social and commercial heart. The moment her cart creaked to a stop in front of the store, she knew something was different. Usually, her arrival was a non-event. The men who loitered on the boardwalks might spare her a glance, but their attention would quickly drift away. Today, It felt as though every eye was on her. Conversations didn't just pause, they stopped dead. Men turned their heads to watch her as she carefully lifted the heavy egg basket from the cart. Their gazes were no longer indifferent or merely pitying. They were sharp, speculative, and tinged with a knowing amusement that made her skin prickle with unease. She kept her own gaze fixed on the store's entrance, her back straight, her movements deliberate. She would not scurry. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She pushed open the door, and the familiar smell of coffee beans, leather, and dust washed over her. The mercantile was dimly lit and crowded with goods that hung from the rafters and were stacked in barrels on the floor. Mr. Abernathy, a small, balding man with a perpetually worried expression, stood behind the long wooden counter. He was serving a group of 3 women who were clustered near a bolt of printed fabric. Ellie recognized them immediately. There was Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife, a woman whose sour expression seemed permanently etched onto her face. With her were Mrs. Pritchard and Mrs. Hemlock, 2 women who were rarely seen apart and who functioned as Mrs. Gable's loyal chorus. "Good morning, Ellie." "Mr. Abernathy said. His voice was a little too loud, a little too hearty. His eyes darted from her to the group of women and back again, and he gave a nervous twitch of his mustache. "Mr. Abernathy," she replied, her voice even. She placed the basket of eggs on the counter. "I have 3 dozen to trade." As Mr. Abernathy began to carefully count the eggs, transferring them into a wooden crate, the women fell silent. The air in the store grew thick and heavy. Ellie kept her back to them, pretending to be interested in a display of canned peaches, but she could feel their collective stare like a physical weight on her shoulders. She knew this silence. It was the predatory quiet that came just before the strike. "Well, I declare, Mrs." Gable's voice cut through the silence. "Sharp and carrying. The things one hears these days. Simply scandalous." "Utterly, Mrs." Pritchard chirped in agreement. "Some people have no shame." Ellie's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She focused on the label of the peach can, tracing the looping letters with her eyes, trying to block out their words. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that they were talking about her. But how, why? "Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat. "A nervous, rattling sound. That will be $1.20 in credit. Ellie, what can I get for you today?" She turned to him, handing him her list, a small, folded piece of paper. She would not let them see that their words affected her. She would conduct her business and leave. Salt, 5 pounds of flour, a can of kerosene, and 2 ounces of laudanum, please. As Mr. Abernathy bustled about, gathering her items, the women resumed their conversation in what they must have thought were hushed tones, but their voices were like wasps buzzing, impossible to ignore. "They say he's out at that shack of hers 2 or 3 times a week." "Mrs." Hemlock whispered, the sound slick with insinuation. "Silas McCrae, Mrs." Gable said his name with a sigh of dramatic disbelief. After all the eligible girls in the county have thrown themselves at him, can you imagine? A man of his standing? The words hit Ellie with the force of a physical blow. So that was it. The secret she had held so close, the quiet, fragile thing she had been nurturing in her heart, was now a piece of sordid public gossip. Her visits with Silas, so sparse and respectful, had been twisted by the town's ugly imagination into something cheap and shameful. A hot flush of humiliation crept up her neck. She stared straight ahead, at the rows of sacks and barrels, her vision blurring. She focused on the sound of Mr. Abernathy scooping salt into a paper bag, the scrape of metal on metal, a small, solid anchor in a swirling sea of shame. Then came the final, killing blow. "One does have to wonder what he sees in her." "Mrs." Pritchard mused, her voice laced with false sweetness. She paused for effect, then added, "And you have to feel for his poor horse? It's a wonder the animal can manage the ride back, carrying such expectations. The other two women let out a titter of suppressed laughter. It was not a loud sound, but in the charged silence of the store, it was as sharp and as cruel as a shard of broken glass. It was an old wound, the one she thought had scarred over long ago, and they had just sliced it open again. All her life, her size had been a source of shame, a visible marker of her unworthiness. She had built a life where it didn't matter, where her strength and competence were the only things of value. But here, in this small, mean-spirited corner of the world, she was once again reduced to a punchline. They had taken the one flicker of hope she had allowed herself, the one man who had ever looked at her without pity, and they had turned him into an object of ridicule, and her into the grotesque reason for it. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to turn around, to confront them, to say something, anything, but she knew it would be useless. It would only confirm their view of her as some desperate, pathetic creature. Dignity was the only thing she had left. She stood perfectly still, her spine rigid, until the last cruel snicker had died out. She watched as Mr. Abernathy, his face now a mask of deep discomfort and his eyes fixed firmly on the counter, finished packing her supplies into a burlap sack. He slid it towards her without a word. She placed the exact credit on the counter, her movements precise and controlled. She did not look at him. She did not look at the women. She picked up her heavy sack, turned, and walked out of the store. She walked with her head held high, her steps even and unhurried, right past the three women who now fell into a sudden, guilty silence. She did not falter until she was outside. In the blinding glare of the sun, she loaded her supplies into the cart, untied Clementine's reins, and climbed onto the seat. She did not look back. She clicked her tongue, and the old mule obediently began the long journey home. The ride back was a blur of dust and misery. The armor she had so carefully put on that morning had been shattered, and now there was nothing to protect her from the pain. The women's laughter echoed in her head, a vicious, relentless chorus. A wonder the animal can manage the ride back. Each word was a fresh cut. The vast, open landscape that had once felt like a comfort now seemed mocking in its emptiness. It was a reflection of her own life, a huge, lonely space that no one would ever want to inhabit. She had been a fool, a blind, stupid fool. She had mistaken a man's kindness or perhaps his pity for something more. She had allowed a tiny seed of hope to sprout in the barren ground of her heart, and the town had poured salt all over it. By the time she reached her hollow, the sun was low in the sky, casting long, mournful shadows. The cabin, her sanctuary, no longer felt safe. It felt like the lonely shack the women had described. She unhitched the mule, her movements stiff and robotic. She carried the sack of supplies inside and set it on the table. She stood in the middle of her small, quiet home, the silence pressing in on her. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. This was her world. This was her reality. There was no place in it for a man like Silas McRae. There was no place for hope. There was only the silence, the solitude, and the deep, aching wound in her heart. A wound that she knew, with a certainty that felt like death, would never truly heal. The days that followed her trip to town were the longest of Ellie's life. The shame and humiliation had cooled into a hard, cold stone in the pit of her stomach. She had been a fool, and the world had been swift to remind her of her place. She worked with a grim, joyless efficiency, her movements sharp and brittle, the quiet of her hollow, once a comfort, now felt like an accusation. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper the women's mocking laughter. She had reinforced the walls of her fortress, mortaring them with anger and resolve. She would not be made a fool of again. She knew he would come back. The knowledge was a dread that lived in the back of her throat. For 2 days, she rehearsed what she would say. She would be polite, but distant. She would make it clear that their strange arrangement of trades and visits was over. She would be cold, transactional, and final. She would take the fragile hope he had ignited within her and extinguish it herself, before the world could do it for her again. On the third evening, she heard the familiar, steady hoofbeats. The sun had just set, leaving the sky a deep, bruised violet, and the air was unnervingly still. Not a single leaf stirred on the cottonwood tree. It was a breathless, waiting kind of quiet. Ellie's heart began a slow, painful thudding. She stood in the center of her cabin, her hands clenched at her sides, and for a moment, she considered not answering. She could let him knock until his knuckles were raw. She could hide in the shadows and wait for him to leave. But that felt like cowardice. It felt like letting the women in town win. She had more pride than that. She would face him. She would be the one to end it. When his heavy knock came, she waited a full minute before opening the door, schooling her face into a mask of cool indifference. Silas stood on her porch, a dark, hulking silhouette against the fading light. He held a small, cloth-wrapped parcel in his hand. He took off his hat, as he always did. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. McCrae," she replied, her voice flat. She did not step aside to let him in. She did not smile. She stood in the doorway, a human barrier. He seemed to notice the change in her immediately. A flicker of confusion crossed his features, quickly suppressed. He held out the parcel. "Brought you some jerky. My cook makes it with pepper and molasses. Thought you might like to try it." This was her moment. She could refuse it, could say she had nothing to trade, could close the door, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she took the parcel, her fingers brushing his. The familiar jolt went through her, but this time she recoiled from it, snatching her hand back. "What do you want for it?" she asked, her tone clipped. His eyes, gray and searching in the twilight, narrowed slightly. "It's not a trade. Ellie, it's just jerky." He had never used her first name before. The sound of it on his lips, so simple and direct, nearly shattered her composure. "I have nothing for you," she said, forcing the words out. "I'm busy. I don't have time for visitors." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. He did not get angry. He did not argue. He just stood there, watching her, his gaze steady and deeply unsettling. She could feel him seeing past her anger, sensing the raw hurt that lay beneath it. He was not a man who was easily turned away. "Something's wrong," he said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. "I'm tired," she lied, looking past him at the darkening plains. It was a long week. He was quiet for another long moment. She prayed he would just leave, that he would take the hint and ride away and release her from this unbearable tension. Instead, he said, "Can I have a drink of water?" It was a simple request, impossible to refuse without outright cruelty. Defeated, she let out a small, frustrated sigh and stepped back from the door. "Fine." He ducked his head to enter the cabin, and the small space was instantly filled with his presence. He moved to the dry sink and ladled himself a drink from the water bucket, drinking it straight from the dipper. Ellie stood by the table, the wrapped jerky still clutched in her hand, feeling like a stranger in her own home. He didn't leave after he drank. He turned and leaned against the wall near the door, crossing his arms over his massive chest. He seemed prepared to wait all night. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. The only sound was the gentle hiss and crackle of the fire in the stove. "I made you uncomfortable," he said at last, his voice low. "Coming here. I'll stop if that's what you want." Her heart leaped. This was her chance. All she had to do was say yes, yes, please stop, leave me alone. Let me go back to my quiet, safe, lonely life. She opened her mouth, but the word wouldn't come. Instead, she looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the profound weariness in his face, the deep-seated sadness in his eyes. It was a loneliness that mirrored her own, a pain that called to the healer in her. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't send him away. To send him away would be to wound something in herself, something that had just begun to stir back to life. "It's not you," she heard herself say, the words soft and unwilling. "It's the town. People talk." A shadow passed over his face, a look of grim understanding. He knew about gossip. He knew about the cruelty of whispers. He nodded slowly. "I know they do." He pushed himself off the wall and came to the small table. He pulled out the chair she had built, the one opposite her own, and sat down. The movement was an invitation. She hesitated, then slowly sat as well, placing the parcel of jerky on the table between them. They sat in silence for a long time, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The stillness of the night outside seemed to seep into the cabin, creating a small, intimate pocket of quiet in the vast, dark world. "My father was a hard man," Silas began, his voice barely above a whisper. He stared at the gnarled grain of the tabletop, his large hands resting flat on the wood. He was made of iron and spite. He believed that the world was a brutal place, and the only way to survive it was to be more brutal than the world. Ellie listened, her own troubles receding as he spoke. She could hear the lifetime of pain behind his simple words. "I was married once," he said, and the words fell into the quiet room with the weight of stones. "Her name was Lily. She was like one of those wildflowers you see in the spring, the ones that are so bright and delicate you can't believe they can survive out here. She had hair the color of corn silk, and a laugh that sounded like a bell." He paused, and a muscle worked in his jaw. My father hated her. He hated her because she was soft, because she was gentle. He hated her because I loved her, and he saw love as a weakness. He never laid a hand on her. His cruelty was more subtle than that. It was in the words he used. He would chip away at her, day after day, with a look here, a comment there. He made her feel small, useless. He told her she was a poor rancher's wife, that she would never give me strong sons, that she was a blight on the McCrae name. Ellie felt a cold dread creep into her heart. She could almost picture it, the delicate, pretty girl trapped in a house with a monster, withering under the constant barrage of his hatred. "I tried to stand up to him," Silas continued, his voice thick with old guilt. "But I was young. He owned everything, the land, the house, me. I was just another one of his possessions. I told Lily we would leave, that we would go somewhere else and start over. But she was scared. She had never known anything but that valley. And I think a part of her had started to believe the things he said." He finally lifted his gaze from the table and looked at Ellie. His eyes were bleak, haunted by a memory that would never fade. "One morning, I went out to the barn to fetch a new bridle. It was quiet, too quiet. I found her there. She had used a length of rope. She had decided she couldn't bear his cruelty for one more day. She ended her own suffering. The story hung in the air between them, stark and horrifying. Ellie's breath hitched in her chest. The pain she had felt over a few cruel words in a general store felt like a child's scraped knee compared to this gaping mortal wound. All the hardness in her, all the anger and resolve she had built up over the past few days, simply melted away, replaced by an overwhelming wave of compassion. "The town, they whispered," Silas said, his voice dropping so low she had to lean forward to hear him. "They pitied me. They said I was cursed, that my father's darkness was in my blood, that I brought ruin to everything I touched." He let out a harsh, bitter breath. "And the worst part is, I believe them. I am cursed. Ellie, my father's poison is in me. Anyone who gets close to me, anyone who tries to care for me, they end up paying a terrible price." He finally looked down at his own hands, splayed on the table. They were huge, scarred, powerful hands. But at that moment, they looked like the hands of a man who was terrified of his own strength, of the damage he was capable of causing. Ellie sat in the ringing silence, her heart aching for him. She saw it all now, the deep, abiding sadness in his eyes, the caution in his movements, the loneliness that clung to him like a shroud. He wasn't just a lonely man. He was a man who believed he deserved to be lonely, that his solitude was a way of protecting the world from the curse he carried. Without thinking, without planning, she reached across the table. Her hand, large and calloused from years of hard work, covered his. It was a simple gesture, but it was the most intimate thing she had ever done. His hand was trembling slightly beneath hers. She did not pull away. She just rested her hand there, a quiet, solid weight. He looked up at her, his gray eyes wide with a raw, unguarded vulnerability. He looked like a man who had not known a gentle touch in a very, very long time. She did not offer him platitudes. She did not tell him he was wrong or that it wasn't his fault. The wound was too deep for such flimsy bandages. Instead, she met his gaze and spoke the truest words she knew, the words that came from the very core of who she was. "I am not afraid of pain," she said, her voice low and steady and clear, "if it means I can heal someone." The words settled in the quiet space between them. It was not a declaration of love, but something far more profound. It was a declaration of purpose. She was a healer. She tended to broken things, and here, before her, was the most broken man she had ever met. And for the first time in her life, she felt not fear, not shame, but a powerful, unwavering sense of rightness. This was where she was supposed to be. This was what she was meant to do. A single tear escaped from the corner of Silas's eye and traced a path through the dust and stubble on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just stared at her, at the woman who was not afraid of his darkness, at the hand that was covering his, offering not judgment, not pity, but a quiet and unconditional promise of solace. The night Silas McCrae shared the story of his wife was a turning point. A fragile bridge had been built between their two solitudes, a structure made not of promises or romantic words, but of a shared, silent understanding of pain. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself, quieter and deeper than before. His visits were still sporadic, but they were no longer about trades or repairs. He came simply to sit on her porch, to drink a cup of coffee, and to exist in a space where he did not have to pretend he wasn't haunted. He spoke little of his past, and she never asked. She would simply bring out a second chair, and they would watch the sun set, the silence between them no longer dangerous or uncertain, but comfortable, like a well-worn blanket. For the first time in her life, Ellie did not feel lonely. She was still alone, but the quality of that aloneness had changed. It was no longer a state of lack, but a peaceful quiet that was, on occasion, shared. This newfound peace made the arrival of the new threat feel all the more violent, like a rock thrown through the window of a quiet room. The news did not come from Silas. It came from a young ranch hand from the Cross Creek, a boy named Caleb with frightened eyes and a perpetually worried expression. He rode to her cabin one blistering afternoon, his horse lathered and his face pale beneath a layer of dust. He needed a poultice for a rope burn, but that was just an excuse. "It's Jedediah Kane, ma'am," he said, his voice low and tight as she cleaned his wound. "He's come back." Ellie had heard the name. Kane was less a man and more a plague. He was a land speculator from the East, a man who dealt not in cattle or crops, but in paper and intimidation. He would find some flaw in an old land grant, some forgotten tax lien, and use it as a wedge to pry hard-working people from their homes. He never used his own gun. He hired men who were happy to use theirs for him. He was a vulture who circled, waiting for the slightest sign of weakness. "He's laid claim to the north pasture," Caleb continued, wincing as she applied the soothing comfrey paste. "Says his survey shows the creek bed is the true boundary line. Not the ridge. It's a lie. Everyone knows it's a lie. But he's got a piece of paper from some judge back in St. Louis." "What does Mr. McCrae say?" Ellie asked, her hand steady, but her heart had begun a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. "He told Kane to get off his land." Kane just smiled, said the law would see it his way. and that he'd be back in 1 week with his own men to start building fences. Mr. McCrae. He just stood there and watched him go. He hasn't said a word to any of us since. He just looks at that northern ridge, like he's measuring for a grave. When Silas came 2 days later, she saw the truth of the boy's words. The quiet peace was gone from his eyes, replaced by the old, familiar darkness, now honed to a sharp, dangerous edge. He looked tired and grim, and the haunted look she had come to understand so well was back in full force. He sat on the porch step, staring out at nothing, turning a cold cup of coffee in his hands. "Caleb came by," she said gently, sitting in the chair nearby. "He told me about Mr. Kane." Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't look at her. "It's ranch business. Nothing for you to worry about?" "It sounds like more than business," she said, her voice firm but quiet. "It sounds like trouble." "Trouble is my business," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Always has been." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were cold, distant. He was shutting her out, deliberately rebuilding the wall between them. "This is a McCrae fight. It has nothing to do with you." "Anything that brings that look back to your eyes has to do with me," she said, her words bolder than she felt. A flicker of something pain, anger, regret crossed his face. "Then you shouldn't have let me in," he said, his voice rough. "I told you, I bring ruin. This is what it looks like. Kane isn't just after the land. Ellie, he's after the name. He smells blood in the water. He knows my father is dead and thinks the son is weak." He stood up abruptly, his large frame blocking out the evening light. "I came to tell you not to expect me for a while. It's best if you stay clear of all this." He was pushing her away, trying to protect her, but doing it in the only way he knew how, by retreating into his curse. He was going to face Jedediah Kane and his hired guns entirely alone. The thought was a shard of ice in her chest. She watched him mount his horse and ride away, his back as rigid and unforgiving as a cliff face. He did not look back. For a full day, Ellie was paralyzed by a feeling of helpless fury. She raged at his stubbornness, at his pride, at the cruel father who had beaten this self-destructive solitude into him. But as her anger cooled, it was replaced by a cold, clear certainty. She had told him she was not afraid of pain if it meant she could heal someone. And healing, she now understood, was not just about soothing old wounds. Sometimes, it was about standing between a person you cared for and the new wounds the world was determined to inflict. She would not let him face this alone. The next morning, she hitched Clementine to the cart and made the journey to Redemption. This time, she was not going for supplies. She was going to war. Her first stop was Abernathy's Mercantile. The store was empty save for the proprietor, who was morosely dusting a high shelf. He looked surprised to see her back so soon. "Ellie," he greeted her, his nervousness apparent. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, getting straight to the point. "You've heard about Jedediah Kane and the Cross Creek Ranch." His eyes widened, and he immediately started polishing a spot on the counter with a clean rag. "I hear all sorts of things. Ellie, most of it isn't my business." "This is everyone's business," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Kane won't stop with the North Pasture. If he pushes Silas McCrae off that land, what's to stop him from finding a flaw in your deed next? Or the blacksmith's, he's a wolf, and once he tastes blood, he'll want the whole flock." "Mr. Abernathy stopped polishing and looked at her, his face a mask of misery. "What do you expect me to do? Kane has money and guns. I have a dusty store and a bad back. This is between them. It's McCrae business." It was McCrae business when his father was squeezing every homesteader for grazing fees. Ellie countered, her voice sharp. "But this is different. This is a thief trying to steal a man's home. Silas plans to face him alone." "Then that's his choice," Abernathy said, turning away from her. "I'm sorry. Ellie, I can't help you. I have a family to think of." Her heart sank, but she had expected as much. She left the store and walked down the dusty street, her resolve hardening. The fear in Abernathy's eyes had been real. She understood it, but she would not accept it. She saw them then, gathered outside the dressmaker's shop, the same clutch of women who had humiliated her. Mrs. Gable, Mrs. Pritchard, and Mrs. Hemlock. They stopped talking as she approached, their faces curdling with a mixture of surprise and disdain. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with acid. "Come to town to defend your benefactor's honor." The other two snickered. The sting of their old insults was still fresh. But today, Ellie felt no shame, only a cold, focused anger. "I've come to ask for help for a neighbor," she said, her voice clear and steady, loud enough for others on the street to hear. "Jedediah Kane is trying to steal the north pasture from the Cross Creek. He's bringing hired guns. Silas McCrae needs men to stand with him." "Mrs. Pritchard laughed, a high, tinkling sound that set Ellie's teeth on edge. "And why on earth would our husbands risk their necks for that man after the way his father treated this town for 20 years? Besides," she added, her eyes narrowing with spite, "it seems to me he already has all the support he needs right there in your little shack." "This isn't about the past, and it isn't about me," Ellie said, her voice rising. "It's about what's right. It's about not letting a bully with a pocket full of money and a holster full of guns take whatever he wants." "It's men's business," Mrs. Gable said with an air of finality, turning her back on Ellie. "Something a woman like you clearly knows nothing about." "Go home, Ellie. This doesn't concern you." She walked away, leaving their laughter echoing behind her. Every door she knocked on, every person she spoke to, gave her a different version of the same answer. The blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, just laughed in her face. "You think I'm going to go up against Kane's guns for Silas McCrae? The boy's as cold as his old man. Let him fight his own battles." The men in the saloon just shook their heads and turned back to their whiskey. It was not their fight. It was McCrae business. It was a man's problem. She was a foolish, meddling woman. By late afternoon, she stood defeated in the middle of the main street, the dust and indifference of the town swirling around her. No one would help. They were too scared, too selfish, or too steeped in old grudges. Silas was truly alone. And so was she. She climbed back into her cart, her face a grim mask. The journey back to her hollow was filled with a terrible, silent clarity. If the town would not help, then she would. If they thought this was only a man's business, then they would see what a woman could do. She did not rest when she got back to the cabin. As twilight bled across the sky, she went to work. Her anger and fear became fuel, and she moved with a frantic, focused energy. This was a different kind of healing, a different kind of preparation. First, she went to her stores of linen, the clean, carefully folded sheets she saved for special occasions. With a steady hand, she began tearing them into long, neat strips. She tore and folded and rolled them until she had a formidable pile of bandages on her table. She did not allow herself to think about the wounds they might have to dress. Next, she went to her herbs. She took down her mortar and pestle and began to grind. She ground yarrow to a fine powder to staunch bleeding. She crushed willow bark for pain and comfrey root for broken bones. She mixed salves and steeped tinctures, her hands moving with an ancient, practiced knowledge, her cabin filled with the pungent, earthy smells of her craft. This was her ammunition. Then, she pulled out her largest sack of flour and began to bake. She worked the sourdough starter, her powerful hands kneading and folding the dough with a fierce, rhythmic intensity. This was not about making a single loaf for a trade. This was about making sustenance. This was an act of faith, a declaration that they would live to be hungry again. She fired the stove until it was roaring hot, and loaf after loaf went in and came out, the cabin filling with a warm, life-affirming smell of bread. Finally, she gathered the rest of her supplies. She found every length of rope she owned. She filled canteens with fresh water from her well. She sharpened her axe and her skinning knives until their edges gleamed in the lamplight. She worked through the night, a solitary general preparing for a battle that no one else believed she had the right to fight. She knew what they would all say. She was a fool. She was a large, lonely woman playing at things she didn't understand. But as she stood in her cabin in the deep, dark hours before the dawn, surrounded by her neat piles of bandages, her potent medicines, and her stacks of warm bread, she did not feel like a fool. She felt like a healer. She was terrified, more terrified than she had ever been in her life. She knew she could die. She knew that by inserting herself into this fight, she was making herself a target. But she also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that a life lived in fear was no life at all. Silas McCrae had shown her a flicker of hope in the darkness, and she would stand with him in the fire to protect it. The sun was a merciless hammer on the day of the reckoning. It beat down on the wide, empty expanse of the north pasture, bleaching the color from the tall grass and baking the earth until it cracked. A heat shimmer distorted the horizon, making the distant hills tremble. In the center of this simmering, silent world, Silas McCrae stood alone. He was positioned behind a low rise near the creek bed, the Winchester rifle in his hands feeling both familiar and foreign. It was a tool of his trade, used for coyotes and the occasional mountain lion. But today, it felt different. He was not a gunslinger. He was a rancher, a man of the land. But the land was what was being threatened. He had sent his ranch hands away, sending them on a fool's errand to the far southern border to check for fence breaks that didn't exist. This was his fight. The name on Cain's fraudulent paper was his. The curse Jedediah Cain was trying to exploit was his. He would not have other men die for it. He expected to die here. The thought came to him with a strange, cold clarity. He felt no fear, only a profound and weary resignation. This was the culmination of his father's legacy, the final payment on a debt of cruelty and pain he had inherited at birth. He would die alone, on the land his family had bled for. And perhaps, finally, the curse would die with him. He saw them first as a dark, crawling speck on the shimmering horizon. The speck grew, resolving itself into a group of riders, 6 of them. They moved with a lazy, confident arrogance, their horses kicking up a plume of red dust that trailed them like a banner. In the lead was a man in a dark coat and a city hat, a stark contrast to the dusty, sweat-stained men who rode with him, Jedediah Cain. Silas rested the stock of the Winchester against his shoulder, its wooden surface smooth and cool. He sighted down the long barrel, centering Cain's dark coat in his sights. He could end it now. One shot, and the vulture would fall. But he was not his father. He was not a murderer. He would wait. He would let them make the first move. The riders drew closer, the sound of their horses' hooves a low, menacing drumbeat on the hard earth. They stopped 100 yards away, a formidable line of men and horses. McCrae Cain's voice was surprisingly thin in the vast open space, a reedy, unpleasant sound. "I've come to take possession of my property. My men are here to mark the new fence line. I trust you'll not be foolish." Silas did not answer. He remained a still, solitary figure behind the rise, his silence a more potent reply than any threat. It was then that a new sound intruded, a sound so out of place it was jarring. It was the slow, rhythmic creak of ungreased axle hubs and the plodding, steady gait of a single patient animal. From the east, along the narrow track that led from the direction of her hollow, came Ellie's buckboard cart, pulled by the old gray mule, Clementine. Silas's heart seized in his chest. A raw, guttural sound of pure denial escaped his lips. No. He stood up from behind his cover, forgetting Cain, forgetting the guns, forgetting everything but the sight of her. "Ellie, get out of here, go back," he roared, his voice cracking with a desperate terror he had not felt for himself. She didn't even look at him. She guided the mule and cart to a spot well away from the standoff, near the shade of a small cluster of cottonwoods by the creek. Her movements were calm, unhurried. She brought the cart to a halt, set the brake, and climbed down from the seat. She was wearing a simple, practical dress and an old sunbonnet. She looked as if she had come for a picnic. Cain and his men turned in their saddles, watching this bizarre interruption with contemptuous amusement. "What in God's name is this?" Cain sneered. "McCrae, have you brought your cook to surrender for you?" One of his men let out a coarse laugh. Maybe she's the property he's really worried about. The casual, ugly cruelty of the remark sent a white-hot flash of rage through Silas, a fury so pure and absolute it momentarily eclipsed his fear. But Ellie seemed not to have heard them. She methodically unhitched Clementine from the cart, her large, capable hands moving with practiced efficiency. She gave the mule a gentle pat on the rump and led her a little ways downstream, leaving her to drink from the creek. Then she walked back to the cart and stood beside it, her hands clasped in front of her. She simply stood there, a large, immovable woman in a sunbonnet, and waited. Her presence was a silent, profound statement. "I am here. I am not leaving." Silas stared at her, his mind reeling. What was she doing? She was unarmed. She was completely exposed. She was going to get herself killed. His own solitary, noble death now seemed like a selfish indulgence. His curse was no longer just his own. He had brought it to her doorstep, and now she had followed it out here to this killing field. It was in that moment of despair that he saw the first sign of movement on the low ridge to the south, the one that overlooked the entire pasture. A figure on horseback had appeared, silhouetted against the bright sky. It was Gus, the blacksmith, a heavy shotgun held in the crook of his arm. He didn't ride down. He just sat his horse on the ridge, a silent, stubborn sentinel. Cain noticed him, too. A look of annoyance crossed his face. "Who the hell is that?" he snapped to one of his men. Before the man could answer, another figure appeared, this one on foot. It was Mr. Abernathy from the Mercantile, looking small and terrified, clutching an old hunting rifle that seemed too big for him. He stood a few yards away from the blacksmith, his shoulders hunched, as if he expected to be shot at any second. Then another and another. A farmer named Peterson with his 2 grown sons, their faces grim, the liverymen, leading a horse and carrying a pistol. They were not an army. They were not a posse. They were a scattered, awkward collection of shopkeepers and farmers. Men who had told Ellie they wanted no part of this fight. They did not form a neat line or charge down the hill. They simply appeared, one by one, along the ridge, their presence a reluctant, shame-faced testament to something they could not ignore. Cain and his men watched this slow, silent gathering, their amusement turning to confusion, and then to a grim, calculating anger. Their overwhelming advantage was evaporating before their eyes. "What is this?" Cain demanded, his voice now tight with fury. He turned his horse to face Silas. "This is my land. McCrae, I have the law on my side." "You have a piece of paper," Silas called back, his voice steady now, drawing strength from the incredible sight on the ridge, from the impossible woman standing by the cart. "This is my home." The men from the town did not speak. They did not shout threats. They simply stood there, a silent jury, and Silas understood, with a sudden, breathtaking clarity, that they were not there for him. He had seen the contempt in their eyes for years. They were there because of Ellie. They were there because they could not bear the shame of letting a lone woman, a woman they had mocked and dismissed as Big Ellie, show more courage than all of them combined. She had held a mirror up to them, and they could not stand the reflection of their own cowardice. Jedediah Cain, a man who understood leverage better than law, saw his position crumbling. He had come for an easy victory, to intimidate a single, broken man. He had not planned on facing the entire, stubborn soul of a town. "This isn't over, McCrae," he snarled, trying to regain control. "My claim is legal." He made a sharp gesture to one of his men, a hard-faced man with a drooping mustache. "Mark the line." The man hesitated, his eyes darting from the silent figures on the ridge to Silas. Then, with a shrug, he spurred his horse forward, uncoiling a rope with a stake tied to the end. "Don't!" Silas warned, his voice low and deadly. The rider ignored him. He dismounted, lifted a mallet, and prepared to drive the stake into the ground. The first shot did not come from Silas. It came from the ridge, a puff of white smoke, and a split second later, the crack of a rifle echoed across the pasture. The stake flew from the rider's hand, split cleanly in two. All hell broke loose. The hired gun scrambled back to his horse, firing his pistol wildly. The air was suddenly filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, a chaotic, panicked exchange of shots. Puffs of dust kicked up around Silas as he fired back, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder. The men on the ridge fired, their shots mostly high, more a statement of intent than an act of precision. One of Kane's men cried out, clutching a bleeding arm. A horse screamed and reared, throwing its rider. It was over in less than a minute. The violence was a sudden, ugly squall that passed as quickly as it had arrived. Kane, his face pale and his fine coat now covered in dust, saw that his men had lost their nerve. They were hired guns, not soldiers. They were paid to intimidate, not to die. He stared at the unmoving line of men on the ridge, then at the solitary, furious figure of Silas McCrae, and finally at the woman who stood, incredibly, by her cart, untouched and unflinching, as if the bullets were no more than bothersome insects. He had miscalculated, badly. With a curse, he wheeled his horse around. "Let's go!" he yelled to his men. They were happy to obey. They scrambled onto their horses, the injured man helped by a friend, and they galloped away. A disorderly retreat back across the plains, leaving a cloud of red dust to mark their shame. A profound, ringing silence descended on the pasture. The smell of gun smoke, acrid and sharp, hung heavy in the hot air. For a long moment, no one moved. The men on the ridge slowly lowered their weapons. Silas stood with the Winchester still hot in his hands, his knuckles white. His gaze went immediately to Ellie. She had not moved. She stood straight and tall, her hands still clasped, her sunbonnet shading her face. The battle was over. The enemy had fled, and no one had died. Slowly, the men from the town started to drift down from the ridge. They walked awkwardly, not looking at each other, their faces a mixture of relief, lingering fear, and a deep, unspoken shame. They walked past Silas, giving him hesitant, respectful nods, but their eyes, all of them, were drawn to the woman by the cart. She was no longer the town outcast. She was no longer Big Ellie, the object of their pity and ridicule. In the quiet, dusty aftermath of the fight, she was something else entirely. She had not fired a gun. She had not shouted a single word, but everyone standing in that field knew, with absolute certainty, that she was the one who had saved them. She was the woman who had protected a man, and in doing so, had redeemed a town. The silence that descended upon the north pasture was heavier and more profound than the one that had preceded the violence. The acrid smell of gun smoke hung in the hot, still air, a bitter perfume of what had almost happened. For a long, stunned moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The men from Redemption stood frozen on the ridge and in the field, a scattered and bewildered audience to a play that had ended unexpectedly. They looked at the cloud of dust where Kane and his men had vanished, then at Silas McCrae standing like a monument of fury in the center of the field, and finally, their gazes all came to rest on the woman by the mule cart. It was Gus, the blacksmith, who broke the spell. He lowered his shotgun, resting it stock on the ground, and cleared his throat with a sound like rocks grinding together. "Well," he said, to no one in particular, "that's that, then." The words seemed to release them. The men began to move, their actions awkward and uncertain. They did not cheer. They did not congratulate each other. They seemed eager to leave, to escape the scene of their own shamed courage. As they drifted past, heading back toward the town, they gave Silas hesitant nods of respect. But as they passed Ellie, Their expressions were different. They looked at her with a kind of baffled awe. Some of them tipped their hats. Mr. Abernathy, clutching his rifle as if he'd forgotten how to put it down, simply stared at her for a moment before turning away. His face flushed. They offered her a respect that was clumsy and new, born of the sudden, shocking realization that they had misjudged her entire existence. One by one, they disappeared over the ridge, leaving their dust to mingle with the dust of the retreat. Soon, the pasture was empty again, save for two people, a gray mule, and the silent ghosts of the confrontation. The adrenaline that had sustained Silas began to drain away, leaving a hollow, trembling exhaustion in its place. He lowered the Winchester, his arms suddenly feeling as heavy as lead. He looked at Ellie, who was now calmly walking towards him, her bonnet slightly askew, her face serene. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He had prepared himself to die alone, a final, fitting chapter to the cursed story of his life. He had not, under any circumstances, prepared himself to be saved. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice the first gentle sound in this harsh, wounded landscape. Her eyes scanned him, the healer's gaze missing nothing. "No," he said, the word coming out as a rough croak. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding," she stated simply, her eyes fixed on his left side. He looked down. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his shirt. Just above his belt, a bullet must have grazed him during the brief, chaotic exchange, and he hadn't even felt it. He had been too consumed with rage, too focused on her safety. "It's nothing," he said, a reflexive dismissal. She ignored him. "Come," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Let's go home." The word hung in the air between them. Home. She meant her cabin, her small, solitary refuge. But the way she said it, it sounded like a shared destination. He didn't argue. He felt a sudden, bone-deep weariness, as if he had been fighting this battle not just for a day, but for his entire life. He allowed her to take the heavy rifle from his hands. She laid it in the back of the cart, then turned to him. He was swaying slightly on his feet. Without a word, she put a steadying hand on his good arm, and he leaned on her, just for a moment, the strength and solidity of her a surprising comfort. The journey back to her hollow was conducted in near total silence. The setting sun painted the sky in streaks of orange and deep purple, and the world grew soft and quiet. The only sounds were the creak of the cart's wheels and the soft plod of Clementine's hooves. Silas sat on the buckboard seat, his side throbbing with a dull ache, and watched her. She handled the reins with a calm, steady competence that seemed to be the very core of her being. She had faced down armed men. She had shamed a town into courage. She had saved his land, his life, and very possibly, his soul. And now she was driving him home as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When they arrived, the cabin was a beacon of warmth and welcome in the gathering twilight. She helped him down from the cart and led him inside. The air was thick with the comforting, life-affirming smells of baked bread and dried herbs. The preparations she had made for a battle were now the comforts of its aftermath. "Sit," she commanded softly, gesturing to the chair by the hearth. He obeyed without question. He felt like a stranger in his own body, his will and his pride stripped away, leaving only a vast and humbling gratitude. He watched as she lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows. She stoked the fire in the stove until it crackled cheerfully. Then she came to him with a basin of warm water, a clean cloth, and the neat rolls of bandages she had prepared the night before. "You'll need to take off your shirt," she said, her voice matter-of-fact, betraying no hint of nervousness. He hesitated for a moment, then complied, pulling the blood-stained garment over his head. The wound was a long, ugly furrow across his ribs, scraped raw and bleeding sluggishly. It was not deep, but it was painful. She knelt before him, dipping the cloth in the warm water. Her touch, when it came, was incredibly gentle. She cleaned the wound with a methodical, practiced care, her brow furrowed in concentration. The silence in the cabin deepened, punctuated only by the hiss of the fire and the soft sound of the cloth against his skin. He watched her, mesmerized. He watched the play of the firelight on her honey-colored hair, the focused intensity in her eyes, the gentle sureness of her large, capable hands. These were the hands that had faced down his demons, the hands that had reached across a table and held his own when he had confessed his deepest shame. He had been so wrong about so many things. He had thought his curse was a wall, separating him from the rest of the world, but she had simply walked through it, as if it were nothing more than mist. When she finished cleaning the wound, she applied a cool, soothing salve that smelled of yarrow and pine. The sting of the graze immediately began to recede, replaced by a dull, comforting warmth. She then took one of her prepared bandages and began to wrap it snugly around his torso, her movements efficient and sure. As she worked, her face was close to his, and he could feel the soft whisper of her breath. He could see the small, stray hairs that had escaped her braid, glowing like a halo in the lamplight. She finished her work, tying the bandage with a neat knot. Her hands rested on his shoulders for a moment. A silent question, asking if it was too tight. He just shook his head, unable to speak. She stood and moved to the table, cutting a thick slice from one of the loaves of bread she had baked. She brought it to him on a small wooden plate. It was a simple offering, but it felt like a sacrament. He took it, the bread still warm, the crust crisp, the inside soft and light. He took a bite, and the simple, honest taste of it seemed to fill all the hollow, empty places inside him. He looked at her, standing by the fire, her silhouette strong and solid against the flames, and the words he had never known he needed to say rose to his lips. "I have a cook at the ranch," he said, his voice quiet and rough in the still room. "A good one. I don't need someone to cook my meals." He paused, and his gaze met hers across the space. The firelight danced in her eyes. "But I need someone," he continued, his voice thick with a truth he was only just beginning to understand. "I need someone to know I'm still alive." It was the most honest thing he had ever said. It was an admission of a need so profound it terrified him. He was not just a rancher, a fighter, a McCrae. He was a man who needed a witness to his life, someone to stand in the quiet moments and simply know that he was there, breathing, living, surviving. Ellie stood very still, her expression unreadable. She looked down at her own hands, then back up at him. When she spoke, her voice was a low, hesitant whisper, filled with the echoes of a lifetime of insults. "I'm not a beautiful woman, Silas," she said, the words a painful, vulnerable confession. "I'm not tidy or graceful. I was never taught how to be a wife. I don't know how to—" She trailed off, unable to finish. She was laying all her perceived flaws at his feet, all the reasons the world had given her for why she was unworthy of love or companionship. It was a test, a final, desperate plea for him to see her as she saw herself, so that the inevitable rejection would not hurt so much. Silas looked at her, at this magnificent, courageous, and profoundly beautiful woman who saw herself as nothing more than a collection of shortcomings, and his heart, the broken and battered thing he had thought incapable of feeling, ached with a sudden, overwhelming tenderness. He set the plate of bread aside and leaned forward, his gray eyes holding hers, his voice filled with a conviction that swept away all her doubts. "I don't need someone beautiful. Ellie," he said, his voice low and fierce with emotion. He reached out, his large, scarred hand closing over hers. "I need someone who dares to hold my hand when I'm broken." Her breath hitched, and her eyes filled with tears, but she did not pull her hand away. He held it tightly, a silent, binding promise. They sat there for a long time, their hands clasped, the silence in the cabin no longer heavy or unspoken, but filled with a fragile, luminous, and deeply earned peace. The world did not change overnight. There was no grand apology from the town of redemption, No sudden anointing of Ellie as a hero. Change, she discovered, was a much quieter and more gradual thing. It arrived not in words, but in silences. When she next drove her cart into town, a week after the confrontation, the air itself felt different. The usual stares that followed her were still there, but their quality had shifted. The sharp edges of mockery and pity had been worn smooth, replaced by a grudging, baffled respect. As she walked toward the mercantile, Gus the blacksmith, who was shoeing a horse outside his smithy, stopped hammering. He looked at her, his face grim, and gave her a short, sharp nod before turning back to his work. It was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. Inside the mercantile, Mr. Abernathy's usual nervousness was gone. He met her eye directly, a thing he had rarely done before. "Ellie," he said, his voice quiet. "Good to see you." He took her eggs and, instead of counting them with his usual meticulous suspicion, he simply marked the full credit in his ledger. "I set aside some of that peppermint candy you like," he added, gesturing to a small paper bag on the counter. "No charge." It was his apology, clumsy and unspoken, and she accepted it with a simple, "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy." The women were there again, Mrs. Gable in her chorus. They saw her enter, and a sudden, uncomfortable silence fell over their conversation. They did not snicker. They did not whisper. They watched her with tight, unsmiling lips, their eyes filled with a new and unfamiliar emotion. It was not admiration. It was a kind of resentful awe, the look one gives to a force of nature one does not understand but can no longer deny. Ellie conducted her business, gathered her supplies, and walked out, the weight of their silent, envious stares a strange and unfamiliar cloak on her shoulders. This quiet, seismic shift in the world around her began to work a change within her as well, for her entire life. She had moved through the world apologetically, her drab, sturdy clothing a form of camouflage, her downcast eyes a plea not to be noticed. She had built her identity around the world's perception of her. She was large, she was plain, she was alone, and therefore she was unworthy of beauty or joy. One afternoon, while searching for a spare patch of canvas in an old trunk, her fingers brushed against a piece of fabric she had forgotten existed. It was a length of printed cotton her mother had carried with them from the East, folded neatly at the bottom of the trunk. It was patterned with small, cheerful blue flowers against a cream-colored background. In the past, Ellie would have dismissed it as frivolous, something for a different kind of woman. But now, she held it up in the dusty light of the cabin, the soft, worn material cool against her hands. She thought of Silas's words, "I don't need someone beautiful." He had not meant that beauty was worthless. He had meant that the world's definition of it was. He had looked at her and seen not her size or her plainness, but her courage and her capacity to heal. For the first time, she wondered what she might look like if she saw herself through his eyes. That evening, she threaded a needle, and by the flickering light of her lantern, she began to sew. She did not use a pattern. She cut and stitched according to her own measurements, her own shape, her own needs. The work was slow and deliberate, each stitch a small act of reclamation. With every flower she joined to the next, she was stitching together a new version of herself, one that was not defined by the scorn of others, but by the steadfast respect of one good man. A few days later, when Silas rode into her clearing, she was on the porch, mending a saddle blanket for him. She was wearing the new dress. The blue flowers were a startling splash of color against the muted tones of the landscape, and she had tied her hair back with a matching blue ribbon. She felt ridiculously exposed, as if she had stepped out of her own skin. He dismounted and stopped, his gaze taking in the sight of her. He did not say anything for a long moment. She braced herself for a joke, or perhaps for him not to notice at all. But when he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with a quiet reverence. "That's a fine dress, Ellie." And she, who had never known what to do with a compliment, simply said, "Thank you." Their life together settled into a new shape, one that had no name and followed no rules but their own. There was no public declaration, no talk of marriage, no ceremony in the small clapboard church in town. Such things belonged to the world that had, for so long, rejected them both. Instead, they built a life in the quiet spaces between their two homes. His ranch, with its sprawling fields and sturdy barns, was the strong, protective bone structure of their world. Her small cabin nestled in its quiet hollow was its warm, beating heart. They were two distinct parts of a single, unnamed home. Most evenings, Silas would ride over from the Cross Creek, his long day's work done. He would eat supper with her at her small table, his large frame filling the little cabin with a comforting, solid presence. Afterwards, they would sit on the porch, and he would talk. He was not a man of many words, but with her, he found a voice. He told her not of the great, sweeping dramas of the West, but of the small, simple things of a stubborn calf that refused to be weaned, of a ranch hand's comical attempts to woo the new schoolteacher, of the way the light hit the canyons in the early morning. His stories were spare and dryly funny, and Ellie found herself laughing. Not the small, hesitant chuckle she had sometimes allowed herself, but a deep, full-throated laugh of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the sound of a woman who was no longer afraid to take up space in the world. He began to leave his mark on her hollow, not as an owner, but as a partner. He saw that her porch steps were unsteady and, without being asked, spent a whole Saturday building her a new porch, wide and sturdy. From fresh-cut pine, he noticed her pantry was too small for the stores she needed for winter, and he built her a new one, with deep, strong shelves. He mended her fence, re-roofed her chicken coop, and dug a deeper channel for the spring that fed her well. Each nail he hammered, each board he sawed, was a quiet, practical declaration. It was the language of his love, written in wood and sweat and labor. She, in turn, became a quiet presence at the Cross Creek. She would ride over in her cart once a week, bringing bread and her herbal remedies. The ranch hands, who had once viewed her with the same suspicion as the rest of the town, now greeted her with a profound and grateful respect. She was Miss Ellie, the woman who could soothe a fever, set a bone, and who had, they all knew, saved their boss from himself. She never went to the main ranch house, the cold, imposing structure where Silas's father had ruled and his young wife had withered. That place was still full of ghosts. Her domain was the bunkhouse, the barns, the kitchen, the places where life, honest and unadorned, was lived. The town of Redemption watched all of this, and the gossip, which had never truly died, simply changed its tune. The whispers were no longer tinged with pitying amusement. They were sharp with envy. The women would see Ellie in town, her large frame now carried with an unshakable confidence, a colorful scarf tied in her hair, and they would see Silas McCrae waiting for her by her cart, his eyes following her with an expression of open, unguarded devotion that none of their own husbands had ever shown them. "It's unnatural, Mrs." Gable was heard to say one afternoon in the Mercantile. "She's bewitched him. A woman that size. What kind of hold does she have on a man like that?" "They say she's a healer," Mrs. Pritchard added, her voice a venomous whisper. "Perhaps she uses her potions on him." They could not understand it. In their world, a woman's value was in her beauty, her tidy home, her social standing, and her ability to secure a good husband. Ellie possessed none of these things, yet she had what all of them secretly craved a man who saw her, not as a wife, not as a possession, not as a reflection of his own status, but as a partner, an equal, a port in a storm. They saw the quiet, unshakable strength of the bond between the giant rancher and the large, solitary woman, and they were consumed with a jealousy that was far more bitter than their previous scorn. But the whispers of the town were a distant, irrelevant noise to Ellie and Silas. Their world was the wide-open space between the ranch and the hollow. It was the smell of pine sawdust on his clothes and the scent of baking bread on hers. It was the quiet evenings on the new porch, the shared silence more intimate than any words. One evening, as the last of the sun's fire bled from the sky, they sat together, watching the first stars appear. A cool breeze, a relief after the day's heat, rustled the leaves of the cottonwood tree. "Caleb tried to rope a wild mustang today," Silas said, a smile playing on his lips. "The horse just stood there. Let him get the rope right over its head. Then it looked him in the eye, bit the rope clean in two, and trotted off." Ellie let out a peal of laughter, the sound echoing in the quiet twilight. She leaned her head back against the post, her heart full. She looked at this large, quiet man beside her, at the way the starlight softened the harsh lines of his face, and she felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. She had spent her life feeling invisible, a ghost in her own story. But now, she was seen, not with the cold, judging eyes of the world, but with the warm, steady gaze of a man who had looked into her heart and decided to make his home there. Summer arrived in the high country not as a gentle guest, but as a conquering king. It banished the last of the spring chill, deepened the green of the grasslands, and settled over the hollow with a warm, benevolent weight. The sun lingered long in the sky, and the evenings were filled with the chirring of crickets and the scent of night-blooming flowers. It was a season of growth, of quiet, settled abundance, and it was in this season that Silas McCrae decided to tear down Ellie's kitchen. It was not a grand gesture born of a sudden whim. It was a decision made in his usual, practical way. He had watched her for months, moving about the cramped, dark lean-to that served as her kitchen. It was an afterthought, tacked onto the original cabin years ago, with a low ceiling that forced him to stoop and a single, small window that offered more shadow than light. He saw the way she had to contort herself to get a pan from a high shelf, the inefficiency of the poorly designed hearth. He saw a space that was too small for the woman who inhabited it, a confinement that no longer fit the expansiveness of her spirit. He arrived one morning not with a trade, but with a wagon loaded with tools and freshly milled planks of oak. "The kitchen is a fire trap," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And it's too small. I'm building you a new one." Ellie stood on her new porch, wiping her floury hands on her apron, and simply looked at him. In the past, she would have protested, her pride bristling at what she would have perceived as charity. But she understood his language now. This was not charity. This was his way of mending the world for her, just as she had mended him. This was a love letter written with a hammer and a saw. "The oak will be beautiful," was all she said. The work became the rhythm of their summer. He would arrive just after dawn, and the hollow would echo with the clean, sharp sounds of his labor, the rhythmic rasp of a handsaw cutting through timber, the decisive thud of a mallet, the sharp, ringing report of a hammer driving a nail home. He worked with a focused, patient intensity, his large frame moving with an economy of motion that was beautiful to watch. He was not just building a room. He was crafting a space. His brow furrowed in concentration as he measured and cut, ensuring every joint was true, every angle perfect. Ellie would bring him water in a tin dipper, and they would take their midday meal together in the shade of the cottonwood tree. Sitting on a blanket she spread on the grass, she would pack a basket with fresh bread, cheese, and slices of smoked ham. They spoke little during these lunches. They didn't need to. The companionable silence was filled with the sounds of his work, the hum of the summer insects, and the quiet, steady beat of two hearts that had found their home. She would watch him, his face streaked with sawdust and sweat, his powerful hands, which had once seemed so forbidding, now gentle and precise as they planned the next stage of the construction. The town, when it heard, had its opinions, building for her now. "Is he Mrs.?" Gable sniffed in the mercantile. "He'll be moving in next. I suppose, the shame of it. But the words lacked their old venom. They were the last bitter gasps of a narrative that no longer held any power. The town had seen their courage, and now they were witnessing the quiet, solid construction of their life together. The men, especially, understood. A man didn't build with seasoned oak for a passing fancy. Oak was for permanence. Oak was for generations. The new kitchen rose from the earth, strong and beautiful. It was twice the size of the old one, with a high-pitched roof and 2 large windows that faced east and south, flooding the room with light from dawn till dusk. He built her a long, sturdy countertop from a single, massive slab of pine, sanded so smooth it felt like silk beneath her fingers. He constructed deep, spacious cupboards and a stone hearth for the new stove he had brought from the ranch, a fine, large model with a warming oven. When it was finished, they stood inside it together in the late afternoon. The light streamed through the new windows, illuminating the dancing dust motes and the rich, warm grain of the oak walls. The room smelled of fresh-cut wood, stone, and possibility. It was a beautiful room, a hopeful room. It was a room built for laughter, for shared meals, for a future. A few days later, he came to her in the golden hour, that magical time when the sun hangs low and bathes the world in a warm, forgiving light. The heat of the day had broken, and a soft breeze whispered through the tall grass. He had washed, and he was wearing a clean, dark blue shirt. There was a quiet, solemn purpose in his eyes that made Ellie's heart beat a little faster. He found her on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair, watching the colors of the sky change. He didn't speak at first, just stood before her, his hat in his hands. Then he held out a small, wooden box. It was not a store-bought thing. The wood was dark and smooth, polished by hand, the grain swirling in intricate patterns. It was clearly something he had made himself. She looked from the box to his face, her expression a question. She took it from him. It was light, and it felt warm from his hands. For a wild, dizzying moment, she thought she knew what would be inside. Her fingers, which could set a bone or stitch the most delicate wound, trembled as she lifted the lid. There was no ring. The box was not lined with velvet or silk, but with a piece of soft, clean deerskin. And resting in the center was not a jewel, but a simple, rectangular piece of leather, cut from the flank of a saddle. The edges were beveled and smooth, and words had been carefully burned into its surface with a hot iron, the letters dark and permanent. Her eyes traced the message, her lips moving silently as she read. "You healed me. I'm not afraid to be loved anymore. If you'll have me." The world went very still. The chirping of the crickets, the rustle of the wind, all of it faded away into a profound and luminous silence. This was his proposal. It was not a question of marriage, of property, of a shared name. It was a question far more fundamental. It was a statement of his brokenness, a testament to her healing, and a humble, hopeful request to share a life. He was not offering her a place in his world. He was asking for a permanent place in hers. A wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath washed over her. It was a tidal force of all the lonely years, all the whispered insults, all the quiet heartaches, and all the new, terrifying, and beautiful joys. But she did not cry. The moment was too sacred, too solid for tears. Tears were for grief or for fleeting happiness. This felt like neither. This felt like bedrock. She slowly raised her head, her eyes meeting his. He stood before her, the great, powerful Silas McCrae, and she had never seen him look so vulnerable. His entire heart held out to her in his hopeful, waiting gaze. She gave a single slow nod. "I never stopped having you," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper, as true and unshakable as the earth beneath her feet, even when I thought I didn't deserve to. A visible shudder of relief went through his massive frame. The tension that he always seemed to carry in his shoulders simply dissolved, and for the first time, she saw him completely unburdened. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh features into something boyishly handsome. He did not rush to her, did not sweep her into a dramatic embrace. He simply pulled his own chair close to hers, and she held out her hand. He took it, his large, scarred fingers lacing through hers, and their hands rested together on the arm of her rocking chair. They sat that way for a long time, hand in hand, as the sky deepened from violet to indigo and the first stars pricked the darkness. They did not speak of the future, of plans, of the town. There was no need. The future was here, in the solid warmth of their joined hands, in the quiet, steady rhythm of their breathing, in the shared peace of the summer evening. They sat together on the porch he had built for her, in front of the kitchen he had made for her, and looked out at the vast, dark prairie, their two solitary souls no longer alone, but two parts of a single, silent and unbreakable whole. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help this story reach more people, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support.